This month's ESI State of the Art talk. Peter started his career as a physicist and now has a chair in
climate system dynamics.
I
don't know what it means either. We all have these fancy titles, I think.
And of course, he's coming now also as the director of the Global Systems Demography. So welcome, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you, folks. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt your eating. I hope I don't interrupt you too much. You carry on chomping, it's fine. Or do you like people to be chomping when I'm eating? I was going to talk, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've never been treated quite so well as Amrita treated me with all of that social media stuff that made me feel like a star. Some of that I need to own up to. I did feed some ideas that I'm much more interesting than I actually am, but I'm going to prove that, correct that now. I'm going to talk about adventures in global vegetation modelling. So I'm basically a modeller. Amrita said, first of all, we need a nice picture of you doing something interesting outside, work-related. I thought, well, I'm a modeller. There is no intersection between interesting outside and modelling. But we did come up with these pictures, right? So this one actually is kind of work-related. I got to make this is a nervous smile, by the way. I'm actually scared to death of heights. And that was a tower in the Amazon. That's the closest I've ever got to a real forest. This is nothing whatsoever to do with work. I'm actually burning photography here on Lake Tahoe and looking a bit crazy. But it was supposed to make me look interesting. It is not Amrita's fault, but it is slightly misleading because this is not what I do as a job. As I said, I basically am a modeller, spend a lot of time looking at equations, moaning at code that doesn't work. And I'm going to tell you a bit about why that I think is still interesting, but maybe only to me, we'll see, which is modelling and trying to understand the world so that you can model it. Okay, so my pre-University of Exeter research background, as Cammy said, I was trained as a physicist. I say a theoretical physicist because I was one of these people that was the theorist by virtue of being rubbish in the lab, basically. So I worked in, I did physics at Warwick, and then I went to Cambridge to do part 3 maths. It was really hard, but I was very interested in theoretical ideas. I actually did a PhD on the stability of plasmas in fusion devices. There's a thing called the reverse field pinch, which was almost immediately phased out as soon as I arrived there. If you look at my PhD, it was actually submitted in the early 90s, 1990. I didn't mention climate change at all when I was thinking about fusion. In those days, we actually thought we're going to run out of fossil fuel. That was the problem, we're going to run out of fossil fuel. And that's how much it changed, at least in my mind, between the late 80s and the early 90s. Because when I finished my PhD, I was just so fed up with looking at the damn thing. You probably felt like this about your own PhDs at some point. And it was Christmas time, and I was fed up, and a job came up at the Hadley Centre, which is a new climate prediction centre. I thought, I'll apply for that. That will show them. That will show them that I'm worth more than they think. And I got the job, which was rather bizarre, because I was not qualified at all. So I moved to the Hadley Centre when it first started. This was the Met Office bespoke centre for climate prediction research. And when I got there in 1990, they told me, you're working on global vegetation models. And I didn't say to them, look at my CV, can you see any biology in there at all? But they said, you're going to do it anyway. And the first thing they did is said, go around the world, actually to the US mainly, talk to people who might know something about this. We want you to work out how to model vegetation interactive in the climate model for the first time. And I spoke to some people who really knew stuff, like Inez Fong, for example, at GIST at the time. And she just laughed at me when I said I was going to do this. And I spoke to other people in the US who I really respected, and they simply said, no, better you than me. So it's one of these ones where we could only take it on because we didn't know how stupid it was to try. But as with a lot of modelling, the most useful thing you could do as a modeller is have a go, and then people who know better will improve on it. So it's almost like you get in there first, you say, look how silly this is, but it's interesting, and then they'll do it properly, hopefully. So why do we need to model vegetation and climate models? Basically, they've become a more and more important part of climate models. Some of it is to do with old physical climate, which is the land surface, and the vegetation on the land surface determines the fluxes of water and energy and momentum between the atmosphere and the land. It increases the absorption of sunlight. Basically, plants absorb, as we heard in the previous talk, plants absorb light in the process of doing photosynthesis. They tend to be darker than unlike surfaces, especially when those surfaces got snow on them. They enhance water cycling, especially deep-rooted plants like trees, which can take up water from depth. But also there's a direct interception of water by plant leaves and canopies, which is immediately available for evaporation. So they have a huge impact on accelerating the water cycle. They change momentum transfer by being, if they're tall plants like trees, they make the surface rougher. And the one I'm mostly going to talk about is they provide a land carbon sink currently. Stephen spoke about this before. Roughly a quarter, give or take, of our emissions is taken up by the land biosphere. First and foremost by vegetation taking up carbon, and then by being stored in vegetation carbon and soil carbon. So let's talk a bit more about that. So this is something that at the time we started out in the late 90s to do this vegetation modelling, and it was actually an interactive carbon cycle as well as vegetation. There was just an implicit assumption that the amount of carbon that would be taken up by the land and the ocean, which added up to about half the total, would stay the same. But there were plenty of reasons to believe that might not be the case. And we can actually see them in the year-to-year variation in the carbon cycle. So this is from the last IPCC report, and these are just some figures, but estimates over the decade from 2010 to 2019. So over that period, fossil fuel emissions plus land use emissions were about 11 petagrams of carbon per year. And the atmospheric increase was about 46% of that, about 5.1. And that's typical. This varies from year to year for reasons we'll discuss. And the reason that it isn't total is because about 23% of that period was taken up by the ocean and about 31% by the land. Okay, so this is the residual, because we've got the land use emissions in here, so the remaining land is taking up maybe 30% of our emissions. So it's performing an amazing service for us in making climate change a lot slower than it would otherwise be. But what motivated us at the time, and continues to motivate me now, is that there's reason to know, or there's empirical evidence to suggest this is very sensitive to climate itself. And here's the most obvious case. This is an old plot now, but we can update it. The reason I didn't update it is because I'm lazy, but also because I'm going to return to this plot in a minute in one of the later studies. So the atmospheric CO2, this is up to 2012. The atmospheric CO2 emissions, the anthropogenic CO2 emissions, reaching in this time about, remember it's about 11 now, about 9.5 or 9 and a bit. But the atmospheric growth rate shown in the bottom, which is a conversion from the parts per million change per year, is much, much more variable. So this is the driver of climate change, the predominant driver of climate change. But the atmospheric carbon dioxide doesn't go up like that. It goes up in a much more complicated manner. The difference between these two things is basically the land and ocean carbon uptake, the sum of those two things. And in fact, these peaks are associated with El Nino events. We had a huge one last year, largest CO2 growth rate on record, hottest temperature on record. But the reason the CO2 grew fastest was probably because of the El Nino, predominantly. So what you see is CO2 growth rates go up during El Nino, and this is because tropical land sink weakens or even reverses during El Nino events when the parts of the Amazon, parts of the tropics get hotter and drier. So we sort of know empirically that the idea that the land sink, especially in the tropics, couldn't care less about climate change is not consistent with what we see just in the Mauna Loa record here. You can take the Mauna Loa record and do this yourself. So basically the motivation for this is really to say, well, given what we know of this and our ability to model processes to some extent, what would we expect climate change to do to the fraction of emissions that are taken up by the land? And that motivated us to produce this rather old picture now from Chris Jones, I believe. What we had then was a climate model, very complicated physical climate model, and previously it had been driven, basically the feedback loops were cut at these points here and here, so we put in a prescribed future scenario of CO2 based on some socioeconomic scenario and some assumptions about uptake. And we put in vegetation like the current day, and we deny the fact that when we change the climate, we change the carbon exchanges with the ocean and with the land, and we'd also change vegetation characteristics. Vegetation would move around the globe, change the functional types, the plant functional types might change in response to climate change. And so we just tried to close these two loops, and that's what we did in the late 90s, early 2000s, and just say, well, does it make a difference? And in this particular model, it made a huge difference. I mean, I think an unrealistically large difference, but this is things that make careers when you get a very large result accidentally. So basically, this is a very old animation again from Chris Jones. What I'm going to show you here is what we found. So this is so far ago that we didn't have anything like SSPs or RCPs. We had the IS scenarios. IS 92A used to be called business as usual. So it was getting to probably about, well, what was it? It was getting about 700, 600 parts per million by the end of this century. And that's the dotted lines here. So that's what we did in the old days, which is basically say, let's assume that's what happens to the end of the century. Let's assume that climate change doesn't really affect these things. And what you see in the continuous lines here is what you get when you put this feedback in this particular model. I'm going to just show you the maps. I want you to focus primarily on this one. It has a rather old-fashioned, ridiculous colour scale where blue means less carbon and red means more. So think of this as being green. And this is being something like red, but more. Possibly not helpful. So we're going to do decadal means. What you see here is generally there's an accumulation of carbon, and this is CO2 fertilization on plant growth. And then you'll notice in the Amazon, a huge loss of carbon, the forest dieback that was seen in this model. This is a model that didn't have any direct deforestation. We just said, what does climate change do? And the model was oversensitive in many ways. But what it showed is that when we did what was our best estimate of how vegetation respond to climate, regional climate changes were significant to the point where those best estimates said we worry about the Amazon rainforest even if we stop chopping it down. And a lot of my career has been proving myself wrong on this, but it turns out I'm going to be right, unfortunately. This is what the vegetation cover looked like. So just to show that we had sort of half reasonable for a model of this type, forest cover out to the current day, which was about 2000 then, but it died, started to die back in the 2030s, 2040s, dangerously close to where we are now. I'm going to go back a bit. The reason that happened was basically in this model, this particular plant model, it got really dry and hot in the Amazon, and models were not sufficiently resilient to the warming or the drying before it started to die back. Then we lost that feedback I spoke about before. The ability of vegetation to recycle moisture is lost when the forest is gone. So you end up with an additional amplification of the drying, and it kind of fed in from the northeast coast and just wiped out the forest like that. In this particular model, it was very dramatic. We looked at it for a long time, and the actual qualitative mechanisms seem all right, but actually I think the sensitivities we had in this model happened to multiply together to produce something that was extreme, even compared to the real world. So what we found with this model was it went by the snappy name of Hadsian 3LC, which was the Hadley Centre third generation coupled model with a, I don't know what the other was, low resolution and carbon cycle. And it produced a huge reduction in rainfall in this model and a lot of warming. What we found was that we went back to that Mauna Loa record showing the variation from year to year in the carbon sink, predominantly in the tropics. And we said, does the model look like that? Well, it did, but it was much larger oscillations. So we could tell from the observations from the Mauna Loa record and the El Nino climate variability that this model was spuriously large in terms of its sensitivity to variability in climate. So we could begin to say this doesn't look like the real world in that respect. So we go back to this record again, and we're basically looking at what this variation in the land and ocean carbon sink, in fact the tropical land sink in this case, means in terms of the sensitivity of the land sink mainly in the tropics, to warming, in this case caused by El Nino. We use that as a possible way to understand how the system might respond to anthropogenic climate change. Basically, you can plot it in, this is a very old plot, as you can see. So this is the anomaly in tropical temperature, between 30 north and 30 south. And this is the CO2 growth rate anomaly. So you can see these big peaks. This is the huge El Nino of 98. If I took it on a bit further, you'd see a big peak, and even bigger peak in 2023, when we had a big El Nino. There are cases where it doesn't work. For example, in, well, not very well, in 92, when Mount Pinatubo went off, it had an impact on the carbon sink all over the world, for various reasons. But in general, you tend to see an increase in the CO2 growth rate when there's an El Nino, and a decrease in the CO2 growth rate when there's a La Nina. And you can plot one of these against the other, and you'll get a gradient that tells you something about the sensitivity of the CO2 growth rate to the tropical temperature. When we did that in models, first generation models, we found there was a relationship between the amount of carbon that we were projecting to lose from the tropics, from tropical land as a function of global warming. So typically a range between, what's that, about minus 30 or 30 petagrams lost to 200 petagrams lost. And we plotted it against those same models would predict for this sensitivity of the CO2 growth rate to tropical temperature anomalies. So we basically have El Ninos in these models. They're not exactly identical, but they're similar. And what we found was that all the models that showed dieback were down here. And we have now an observational estimate, because I showed you it. From the real world, we can get an estimate of how big this interannual variability is in the real world. We call this an emerging constraint. I've made my career out of this for the last 10 years, so no criticism yet. You can criticize later. But basically, drawing straight lines between something you want to know, something you can measure, across a model ensemble, and then saying, what do the observations say about where I am on this line? And that means you can relate the present day to the future by virtue of models. So the models define the line, relationship between the present day and the future. The observations define what the real world looks like in the present day. And that sometimes works, not always as well as this, in fact, never as well as this, maybe once as well as this thing. But it does work, it does give a constraint on, and it told us that these models, we maybe don't worry so much about it because they're oversensitive. Been other causes for concern, especially in the Amazon. One was, of course, that under the previous president, anthropogenic deforestation went up a lot. And the combined impact of disturbance, of deforestation and climate change is a bigger concern than any one of those on its own. There was a record-breaking drought in 2023. We heard a bit about that last year from our Brazilian colleagues earlier this year. And then we started to see evidence that the newest models, the models I showed you were CMIP3, third generation coupled model duty comparison project models. Sorry about all the acronyms, but CMIP3. These new CMIP6 ones, which had more sophisticated vegetation models, started to show signs of dieback. So in that early experiment, we were the only model that had anything like that. Didn't have, no other models had vegetation that could change. The ones that did said, it's not a problem. CO2 will sort it out. But in the new models, we're seeing much more evidence in models across the ensemble that there are abrupt events in the Amazon caused by climate variability, sometimes mediated by fire that, as Stephen said, are beginning to appear in these models. And this is from Isabel Parry, who's now a PhD student with me, but was at the time a master's student doing natural sciences master's project. And she came up with an algorithm looking at information from these models that were all modeling vegetation carbon, forest carbon, and this case in a 1% increase of CO2 per year, so quite an extreme increase of CO2. And she found in these red areas, places where these models had some abrupt change, something you might consider to be a localized dieback event. And you can see in this lower right, probably not very low at the back, instances of where these abrupt changes occurred. So the crosses show where those points are for each model. The interesting thing to note about this is that before we had just the Hadley sensor model showing dieback. That's this model here, where nothing goes on now.
You save it.
Sorry?
You save it.
I didn't say it, I think you might have done. Anyway, that's the only model that doesn't suffer, although this model has humongous warming and drying in here. So I'm slightly suspicious. Anyway, so, but the issue is that we went from the situation where one model had dieback to all but one model has dieback in them in some way or other. They aren't as large scale and coherent as the one I showed you before. These are individual events that you might see in a real forest, I guess, where the forest suffers a fire or a drought and then it recovers. But there are lots and lots of instances of abrupt changes you can observe in these models. Quite often we hear things like there are no tipping points in global climate models. Well, it's because we haven't looked for them. The whole world doesn't tip from one state to the other in most of these situations, but locally things do change abruptly, even in models. In fact, sometimes in models even more extremely than in the real world. In some models like this model, it's pretty clear that there's some sort of stochastic element to this. I suspect they have a random number generator that's determining when fires occur, which is why it's speckly like that. But in most, it's coherent, which is indicative of climate changes in those regions that are damaging. Okay, and this is, I'm just going to touch on this, and then we started to see evidence from inventory-based measurements in the forest. Some people in the audience may have been involved in the study. This paper, for example, from rainfall data, which we'll come back to in a minute, suggests that the carbon sink is declining in Amazonia. Here you can see it's on its way down, but it's not because the growth rate is declining, which is what our models would produce. It's actually because mortality rate is going up. We're in a situation now where if we were getting dieback events, in most cases it'd be for the wrong reasons. We'd be getting it because we'd diagnose probably that growth rates were going down because it was getting drier or hotter. But in the real world, that's not what's happening. Trees are dying. So in order to do that, you need a different sort of a model. A better model, but one that recognises that there are individual trees, not just a kind of green moss on legs that we had before. I never called it that when we actually, that's what we were doing, but that's better. Okay, so you need better vegetation models to reproduce these observations. You need models that at least recognise that trees have a life cycle, that they come from seeds and they die at some point because of mortality in various forms. And that means you need a different sort of a model. So those models, so the model that we used in that first thing was called TRIFID, developed by me and Richard Betts, who some of you know, and Chris Jones at the Met Office. And the best thing about that model is its acronym. I will tell you this acronym in full if you ask me. So I wouldn't ask me if I were you. It's a very robust model. I'm still very proud of it. It's still used in the Hadley Centre models, but it is incredibly, the T stands for top down because it is incredibly top down. It is a phenomenological model. If I could say that, that's what it would be. It is about modelling just the high level variables. So mean vegetation carbon content for each plant type, mean leaf area index per unit area, mean height, and basically treating plant mortality as a constant. Okay, so when things change in these models, it isn't because of mortality changing, it's because the carbon balance changes. That's how things die in these models. They just go to negative carbon balance and then quite nice to think such and such didn't die, they just went to negative carbon balance, but that's not the way it is. So tree life cycle, including size-dependent growth and mortality, which we generally call demography. It's important to predict changes in forest carbon in response to climate and land use changes. So as we're asked more and more things about how would you manage forests, how would you regrow forests, a lot of that comes down to size-dependent demographic processes. And so you can't do those really with the models we've had to date, even though we've tried. But, and this is always the problem for a modeler, is how do you get the required sophistication into the model without making it so complex numerically, so full of parameters you don't know that you can't use a damn thing. And that's always a tug of war. And many of you will have been in arguments with me about where we are in this tug of war, where maybe Lena or Lucy's pulling me that way towards making things really complicated. I'm trying to go back here to something really stupidly simple. And that's the sort of tug of war you have when you do global modelling. It's, well, how do you get just what you need and nothing else, basically? And I stole this picture from Sci-Fi, I think, lovely picture. But if you look down on a tropical forest, this is what it looks like. If I were to show you a similar representation of that Triffitt model, it would be a uniform canopy of a uniform height, of a uniform greenness, and it does look like that. And that's rather important because these individual trees that have different experiences of climate change, there are different vulnerabilities to it. So somewhere along the line, you have to represent that. But at one end of the spectrum is those very simple models that just say, let's take the average, whatever the average is, we'll try and model that. The other end are individual-based models, which are hideously difficult to use at global scale. There are models like that, but they suffer from the fact that they can never have enough trees to be statistically significant. So what is something in between? And we, remember I'm a physicist, so I'm always going to think about something that looks like a physicist equation. So we came up with a thing called the Robust Ecosystem Demography model. And this looks complicated, but it's not. Forget about this right-hand side for a moment. Think that was zero. This is just a continuity equation. This is d rho by dt plus div of rho v, like the continuity equation for fluid, is zero. What we're trying to model now is not just the mean tree height, the mean tree carbon, the mean tree leaf area. We're trying to model the number of trees of a given mass as a function of time. So we're trying to grow an ensemble of trees. But what we're not doing is growing each individual tree. We're just looking at the statistics of that. So what's in here are two terms that matter. One is the growth rate of a tree as a function of its mass, and the function of time, because the time bit is what includes climate change, for example. And the other is the mortality, gamma, as a function of mass and time. Actually, at the moment, I'm going to just call that constant. So rather going back what I just told you, but in principle, these things are a function of size. For example, tall trees and the Castronarix experiment are known to be more vulnerable to droughts because it's more hard to get the water up there, presumably. They suffer sort of xylem damage and so on. So all we're doing really is updating this equation now. The growth rates come from the previous model. They are what you might call net primary productivity, you know, basically the photosynthesis minus the plant respiration, minus some litter fall, because plants are losing leaves and branches all the time. And the gamma here is a number we're going to choose based on observations. This is a rare thing for me to actually look at observations before I choose a number. So the simplifications here, we made these basically because we're in a maths department and we had to be able to solve this analytically, or else it wasn't maths. So basically we made some simplifications and we just thought, well, let's just assume the world's really simple. And the first one we said is that we'll assume that the growth rate of a tree goes like a power of its mass. So it's a power law, and those things are typically a bit easier to solve for. We apply Occam's razor. This is just an excuse for putting all the stuff under the carpet, right? And we're going to assume that gamma, the mortality, is independent of mass. All right. Now, it isn't exactly, but it is to a reasonable approximation in large-scale ensembles a sort of effective parameter. And then we go to metabolic scaling, and metabolic scaling says this parameter here is 3/4. I don't know if any of you know about metabolic scaling. It's kind of a widely discussed idea, but essentially the idea that plants and actually organisms in general have relationships between metabolism and size that are determined by how efficiently you can get nutrients in and out of the system. And that's a fractal-like structure, and it gives you 3/4 power. We could have used a different power. It turns out 3/4 is about the best guess. But it's one of these things where we just needed something to make it simple. And when we did it, we looked at data, we found that we could solve the problem for the equilibria, so the steady states of the size structure, and it looked really like the real world. I mean, we might have been looking at it through modeller's eyes, like, you know, keep averaging it so it looks like a model, but it did look like the real world. So this is the main reason to make these simplifications was initially to have a model that we could run in a climate model. So this is from Arthur Argles, who did all the numerical work here. Just going to flash by you. So this is just to prove to you, you can come up with a model based on these equations with simple competition between different plant types. You can run globally. It's not quite as fast as this animation suggests, but this is spinning up from bare soil. On the right there, we've got the dominant vegetation type. And this is after 300 years. So essentially, we let the thing go. We give it some productivity that we've calculated per unit of vegetation from the joules vegetation model, and we spin it up. And trust me, this is remarkably like the real world, partly because we chose mortality rates that made sure it was, but I think they're reasonable mortality rates. So I'm just going to do that again because it's just too cool, right? So you can see the forest. So for example, go back again. If it, you can see the boreal forest emerge here, the tropical forest emerge there. The timescales of this are still quite long, but we, in the old Trifid model, it used to take thousands of years to spin the damn thing up. And this was actually spinning up more like you were actually growing trees. So quite pleased with that. We can compare it to what we get from remote sensing. But I have to tell you, there is a degree of fiddling here. So what we do is we take productivity from the Jules model, this G factor, the growth rate, and then we say what mortality rates would we need to have for each PFT to get the right functional cover. So we have a spatially varying mortality rate. You might think of that as partly sort of implicitly accounting for disturbance. Also, it's hiding a bit of the errors we might have in our growth rates in the model. But it does mean you can get a very good representation here of the state as seen from satellite. How are we doing on time? Sort of. Okay, so the other thing that you get out of this model, and this is what we got excited about originally, is you get size structure. So you're not just getting one uniform average tree size, you're getting a range of trees. So this is the number density, it's the number of trees per metre squared of land, and this is the mass of the tree. And you'll notice that you get a drop off. This is when this is a straight line, this is something called self-thinning. So you tend to have increasingly smaller numbers of larger trees if you're in a forest, and increasingly more small trees. And this model spun up here. So essentially, these are the states it's going to end up at, and it spins up, and these profiles develop through those equations I just told you, which I showed you, which are not complicated, but they do allow you to evolve it dynamically. These are different plant functional types. I haven't got them labelled here, but they're different plant functional types. This one here is the evergreen broadleaf tree, so a tropical tree, really. The thing to notice about this is you might think, why the devil does he care about this? Sometimes I think that too. But these curvatures here are indicative of mortality. So it turns out that without any mortality, these would be dead straight lines, this self-thinning profile. But the reason you get down here and you've got less trees is basically because trees don't live long enough to get that big and that growth rate. So what they actually, the curvature is determined by the ratio of mortality to growth for a reference mass. It doesn't really matter what reference mass it is. And so from these, if we look at the real world and they look like this, we can kind of work out the mortality rate as a ratio of the growth rate. It is what determines that curvature. So we looked at, John Moore actually, looked at rainfall data from all these sites. Fabulous resource, the rainfall data. And this is, you're going to have to believe me because this doesn't show up. Actually, there's a huge peak here, just here. Honestly, there is. But for some reason, they decided that data is not worth showing. The other thing on this side is we check this metabolic scaling, and that also has a peak around the metabolic scaling value. So essentially what this was suggesting to us is that there's no good reason. There's many separate sites. This has got, imagine there's a histogram here. And there's a big peak. The big peak in the middle says, for most sites, they have a universal value of this ratio of mortality to growth. So they've got a certain curvature. Blew us away. We thought, well, why would that be? Why is it like that? Still not quite sure, but that's what we see. So look at all these sites in the tropics, or look even in the USDA data, huge number of 1.6 million trees across 61 species, do the same thing, get the same curvature. Kind of amazing, really. I mean, you think, well, they've got different growth rates, different environments, surely different mortality rates. But then you plot them against each other. So in blue here is this USDA data. Some of these are semi-managed. In green is the rainfall data. They're basically the same line at large masses, right? Basically the same line. So that implies the same mortality to growth ratio, which is kind of funky, really, that these totally different systems would have that. Okay. So we came up with a everyone has to have an optimality hypothesis when you're doing vegetation modeling. We came up with the optimality hypothesis we call demographic optimality. And it was published late last year by John Moore and Arthur Argles and me. That basically the forest maximised tree number. So now we're calculating this N, this number of surviving trees. And you might imagine that they want, if you're thinking about Darwinian competition, what would you most want to do as a species is to have as many surviving offspring as possible. And that's basically the tree number, N, at any one time in equilibrium. And they maximise biomass as well. And that's basically because they're in competition with other plant functional types, and they've got to get to the light, and they need to get tall to get to that. And when you do that, and you make some other assumptions I'm not going to tell you about because they're going to undermine my argument, you do find that there's an optimum value of the ratio of mortality to growth, which determines this. Okay, and there's an optimum value of the amount of the total assimilate you've got that you allocate to reproduction. Not you, trees do. So this leaves an optimum value, the ratio of mortality to growth, and the thing that we call the fraction of assimilate that's allocated to reproduction. In these models, you basically have to say, how do I create new seedlings? And the way we do it, we say some fraction of the total resource you've got available to you, the total growth rate goes into the seedling production. And that number also is optimized by this process. So basically what we're arguing is that the reason these look similar is because it's optimum to do that. And that also means if this is true, then if you've got a tree that grows fast, it also ought to die fast. Live fast, die young thing would be optimal in this case. It's going to grow slow. It should live a long time, basically in the context of this optimization. Nearly done. So this is consistent with a very similarly shaped distributions observed in natural forests across the world. It's a hypothesis, so it probably means it's wrong, but interesting. Okay, I'm going to conclude then. So vegetation models have become a key component of climate models. In fact, they've become called Earth system models now. We put carbon cycles in them. You'll hear climate modelers like me now call them Earth system models, but we're just the same people. We just recognise there's biology and chemistry as well. We made some attempts, the first attempts actually to put vegetation in a climate model. In this model we called HADCM3LC with a TRIFID model, the vegetation model. And we did find evidence that, that in this model the Amazon died as a result of climate change impacts. We also found subsequently that model was oversensitive, and we could tell because the model simulated CO2 variations from year to year that were too large. And they are responses to climate, and that means it was oversensitive to climate. So we're arguing that there are better models required. We've developed a new vegetation model called RED, which is very parameter sparse. Bizarrely, this is the first time in my career as a model this has happened. It's got less unknown parameters, but it has many more outputs. This is time to retire, right, as a modeler. Normally, when you get more outputs, you have many, many more parameters, but this is the only case where I've gone, hold on a minute, less parameters, more outputs. And that's basically because the demography, the fact that a large tree has to have been a small tree before, ties things together in a way that makes things less parameter uncertain than before. Just amazing. And it fits the tree size distribution surprisingly well at large scales, and also suggests a near universal ratio of tree mortality to tree growth rate. So this idea that there may be a reason why fast-growing things die younger and slow-growing things live longer. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter.
My pleasure.
We have lots of time for questions.
So you've alluded to it throughout your talk, and I'm just really interested in your perspective of it. Because I sort of have the same dilemmas when I'm working on models, is how realistic do they need to be? You kind of write that grant application saying everyone's done it wrong, you've got to do it this new way that's better and more realistic. You're sort of talking about this other model that's actually a model which is fewer parameters and seems to do a better job. Is that the way we should be moving, or?
I think generally we should, Ilya, but as you've probably experienced and I have, if I say I've got a simpler way to do things, I don't get published in Nature and I don't get funded. I mean, if I say it's more complicated than you think, I've got a new process I want to put in, I can get both those things. And that's why we got the original stuff funded, because it was the first time it had been done. But when you say I've got a simpler way to do something better, generally it's harder to get that published. It seems a bit almost like, well, making it simpler. But I think that's because we never really think about the uncertainty that's associated with all those additional processes normally. Yeah. Sukhim Minabe, you know, the guy who got the Nobel Prize for Physics a couple of years ago and developed the first GCMs, he used to fight like crazy. He said you need more than a bucket model for the soil, because he thought, I understand that. And we said, but it's not realistic. But I understand that, therefore I can understand how it interacts, and therefore I'm not fighting around thinking what's going on there. So his view was, and I argued with him then, but I'm getting older, so I'll probably agree with him now, is that keep it to the point where you can get something useful out of the model. Of course, when we're asked to do prediction, generally people say, have you got this in? And if you haven't, they'll go, well, it's not a good model. Right. So I always think there's a bit of a tension here between what we want to do as scientists, which is generally to simplify and understand it, and what we need to do to get the funding, which is generally to make predictions that look like they've got a kitchen sink in it. I don't know what the answer is. I think you just have to be a bit duplicitous. If I could say that, I would be. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. So I'm a anthropologist by training.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of work on demography and on regular exploitation sciences. So in your case, can you also distinguish between, for example, microsite limitation or seed limitation, actually limiting your populations?
Seed number of seeds.
Yeah, or microsites, because
Right.
that might be important in how these populations respond to disturbance and
Yeah.
whether they actually have the capacity.
Yeah.
to
So
respond.
I've got to be honest. In this model I showed you,
Yes.
we don't really have seeds. We go straight from some fraction productivity to
Yes.
seedlings.
Mm-hmm.
But we have got a variant that's got seeds in it, and the reason is because you always have an arbitrariness in models on how you initialize vegetation.
Yeah.
So what actually happened in the old models is we said, we don't let the vegetation fraction go to zero because it will never grow back, so we'll only go to a minimum value. And seeds can have some of that information. Well, they do have that information in there, but it requires you to have a history, right,
Yeah.
of the site, which we don't typically have.
Mhm.
But we have begun to put seeds in.
Yeah.
But although I didn't talk about it, the optimization stuff, very interestingly, also predicts things about how seed size and seed mortality are related, such that the benefit of having a larger seed is, or more small seeds is wiped out by the fact a lot of them don't survive.
Yeah, so that's a self thing.
Right, okay, so I'd be good to talk to you. We don't know how far to go with this. We want to keep it as simple as possible, but not have some arbitrary, minimum fraction. We'd like to have seeds. But also we want to make sure that we can initialize the model.
Yeah.
But we are thinking, we have got a seed bank in another version that has this.
That sounds great.
It gets hard.
Yes.
You have to know stuff. You suddenly have to know stuff.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, that's wonderful. I'm just wondering, in those models, do we consider, sort of coming from my background of energy side of it, I mean, do we consider the energy model as a some influencing factor, or for example, I mean, to be very specific, the temperatures. I mean, temperature over the time changes.
Yeah.
And those models, is there any role to those kind of?
Yeah, so they are basically conservation models of various sorts. So they're energy balance models, they're water balance models, they're carbon balance models. Do you mean in terms of energy production, or are you talking about energy fluxes?
Energy fluxes.
Yeah, so absolutely. So before we put carbon in, they were just about energy, really about energy and water predominantly, and that's still what weather forecast models have joules in them. So basically, they need to know what's the moisture flux, what's the energy flux, how much is being absorbed. So all that physical, biophysical stuff is absolutely critical in these models. We didn't until recently, well, fairly recently, bother about the carbon side of things, but that becomes very important when you're thinking about climate change and climate mitigation. On the energy production side, of course, everything I've shown you here is to do with, almost everything is to do with what you might call natural undisturbed forest. But when we run it in a projection, we need to take account of the fact that that's been deforested there. there's been something built here, and eventually we're going to have to say there isn't any vegetation there because there's PV or there's vegetation for different sources underneath. So that stuff's still prescribed. So the humans in these models are still outside, which is regrettable in a way, but it means that you can go to policymakers and say, you are the humans, choose. Whereas if you're inside, it doesn't feel like you can. But essentially, humans are still outside. The Earth system's become more complex, but humans are still kind of godlike or devil-like creatures that make decisions. And I think that's one thing we've always wanted to do at the GSI, this idea that you begin to build in things in that constrain human behaviour to a degree, like the need to get food, or the need to have shelter or whatever, in a way that we can do it with vegetation now to a degree, but we don't yet do it with people. I'm not sure people are more complicated than trees.
Thanks for a great talk. I had just more a general question of how your modelling work has informed your views on potential climate engineering, specifically albedo-based methods versus carbon sequestration.
Yeah. So do you mean as surface-based albedo?
Well, whether you think it's realistic and if you have a preference for one or the other.
No,
think it will happen.
Yeah. So
Just a quick.
yeah. So there are albedo-based methods, like for example, choosing brighter crops that I think are pretty peanuts. And there was also a bit of Stephen Chu, who was briefly the advisor to Barack Obama, wanted to paint all roofs white like you do in the Med. Don't make a lot of difference. I mean, you have to keep them clean and white, and also there's not enough for that to make a big difference.
Release sort of fighting.
Yeah, and that is a much harder one to rule out. And in fact, most of the gut reactions people have against it turn out not to be played out, at least in these sort of models. So, for example, if you do put stratospheric aerosol up, we're pretty sure you can cool the climate down, sort of what happened after Pinatubo. You get a bit less light at the surface, but plants actually like diffuse radiation. Lena showed that. And so, on the whole, it looks pretty good for vegetation. It's not so good for all vegetation, because of course you have regional change. But it's actually really difficult to rule out from a scientific point of view. I mean, from a geological point of view, you might say, well, you're crazy, how are you going to agree on that? But we're in a situation now where we don't have to agree, someone can do it and it'd be legal right now. So we're actually looking at the impact in geomic runs on our vegetation now and on the vegetation of other models, and looking to see what it would do. And it's difficult to rule it out as an emergency measure. I mean, you never get around the need to lower CO2. You probably know about the termination effect. If you do go for and as soon as you stop, you get all your warming quickly. That's the worst case scenario. So you could only use it to cut the top off something. But at the moment, the warming we've got, say, in the last few years, is predominantly driven by a darkening of the planet, not by greenhouse gases. They're important, but they're not. That's not what's led to this big warming. It's actually the planet getting darker. And that seems most likely due to the fact that we've stopped emitting sulfate aerosols, or sulfur dioxide from sulfate aerosols, for a good reason. It's really bad for atmospheric chemistry, bad for us. But as a result, clouds are actually getting darker according to the satellite record. And the SRM approach says, well, let's put some up high where you don't breathe it so much, and we'll counteract it. But there were all sorts of reasons why people are nervous about that. I get that. But we are in a situation now where we've got to start talking about it openly. It's been under the table for so long that it's sort of growing a bit mouldy. Yeah.
Coming back to the previous point of view, so why I mean, I suppose human demographic will much more easily be than why are they not included?
So there are attempts to include them in things like integrated assessment models, but in a very sort of economic-driven way normally. So sort of economics optimization, neoclassical economics type of thing. I think the issue with humans, why they are, is they walk around and they change jobs, and trees generally don't say, well, I'm giving up being a job, I'm going to be a bus driver. They don't do that.
I think the human demographic, the population of the country determines the development of the
yes. Yeah. So that is sort of embedded in the scenarios to a degree. But I think the idea that, migration, for example, it's inevitable when climate change gets very damaging. That feels like that's not a modelable, something you can model. I should have put my teeth in properly this morning. Because it is basically a flow process, right? As a gradient, as a flow, it feels like you could do that. And I'm sure people do that, but we generally don't do them in a coupled sense. And I think it's partly because it gets out of hand pretty fast, but also because we still want to give this idea to a policymaker they're outside making decisions about a thing they're actually inside, you know, it's a different game. But I think it would be useful to start to see those constraints. You know, if you don't see yourself, the end game here seems to be that humans start to see themselves as inside the Earth system, not outside it. So maybe we have to have models to just show that that's the way it is. There will be ways to change such a system, but there won't be godlike things. There'll be internal things you do, right, which would be, I think, more useful. So there's the challenge, the GSI ESI project on putting humans in Earth system models.
Any last questions? Okay, let's give Peter a break and